My name is Jedwin Mok. I was a former research fellow at Metrolinx and a graduate of the University of Toronto computer science program. And I've had the pleasure of working for the past year on this alongside my former advisor, Balthazar Crane from Metrolinx, Dr. Marco Chitti from McGill University, and Dr. Amer Shalaby from the University of Toronto. And our study goes into, why are things so expensive? I think that's the question on everybody's mind, is our transit projects are way too expensive. And so let's get into it. Hopefully, this presentation will answer some questions. So, to give you some background, Toronto is a city in a huge infrastructure deficit, right? We are one of the fastest growing cities and metropolitan regions in all of North America. And that has huge implications on our transportation system. Our subway is chronically overcrowded. We have crippling congestion. And also, our housing market is under strain. And it causes people to travel further and further away, have longer commutes to look for cheaper housing. So, to close the infrastructure gap, you can't just build any infrastructure. And my proposition is that rapid transit is a key solution. So fast transit is a key solution to closing the infrastructure gap. I love telling the story of Paris because it's such a city with quite a similar income distribution to the city of Toronto, where the outer suburbs, dominant minority groups, they have disproportionately lower incomes compared to the city center. And Paris used to have the same problem that the city of Toronto had, right? Like long commutes from the suburbs, a lack of fast infrastructure to get people to their opportunity and their jobs. And when the Paris RER was built in the 70s, it created almost this fast regional railway. Anyone can get on it, democratized fast travel, especially for people in those outer suburbs. And it created greater access to opportunity. So it's really key that we build fast, rapid transit to serve our growing city. And of course, we're doing that. The Toronto region is undergoing the single largest rapid transit expansion program in North America. On the left is the Crown Jewel project, GLOW expansion, which is trying to do what the RER did, 50 years ago. And Ontario Line, of course, our new downtown subway, which will tie all of our projects together. But the problem, of course, is that, right, these projects are way too expensive. What you're looking at is a chart of the per kilometer cost from the 50s to today. And all these costs are inflation adjusted. You can see since the 50s to about the late 90s, subway construction costs actually stayed quite steady and tracked with inflation in Toronto. And the young subway, for example, was built for just under $100 million per kilometer, which is 7 times less than the 2019 estimate for the Ontario line. And when we look at the exponential rise in the growth of transit capital costs in Toronto, you can see that the current estimate for the Ontario line is almost double that at 10 times the cost of the original young subway, over $1 billion per kilometer. So there's a couple of ways that we react to this, and this cost crisis isn't just limited to Toronto, it's spread throughout the country. And in Calgary, for example, they have the Green Line, which is a new light rail line that runs between the city and suburbs. It escalated in cost so much that even after they cut the project in half, the cost still went up by like 2 billion Canadian dollars. And their reaction was, well, it never gets cheaper to build major infrastructure projects. So why should we care about costs, right? Like, we should just build the projects now. Well, as projects increase in cost, the benefits are still the same. So the benefit cost ratio of your project drops and drops and drops. And it's harder and harder to justify the construction of these projects. And that's what happened in Calgary, right? A conservative premier canceled the Green Line, a few weeks ago. And my contention to you is that high costs are not inevitable, right? Low costs are absolutely possible in the Canadian context if we want them. And 3 projects from the last 15 years show us that this is possible. The Vancouver Canada Line and Montreal REM, 2 metro projects that really pioneered low-cost construction and are on par with the lowest cost projects around the world. And Waterloo's Ion LRT, which is also in line with other tramway projects in Europe. So we have to understand, what are these projects doing that we're not here in Toronto? And that's what our research is going to attack. So let's start with our research questions. The first is, how can project planning and delivery be reformed to build transit faster and cheaper? And the second is, how can we refine cost estimations in early stages of the planning to improve the way we prioritize projects to reduce those costs driving planning choices. So our study followed a very, very standard methodology. We started with our research questions, went to an extensive literature review, conducted over 30 qualitative interviews with industry and academic experts. We did a global benchmark then to compare Canadian costs with other costs around the world, and you'll see that in a second. Then we conducted 3 Metrolinx case studies. Now, unfortunately for commercial confidentiality, I can't say which 3, but we did detailed case studies into the project delivery practices at Metrolinx, and then we came to some recommendations. So let's start with the global benchmark. We compiled a data set of 1,083 rail transit projects across 60 countries between 1971 to a projected completion date in 2036. All of the project costs are adjusted for inflation and purchasing power, so we can compare them. And of course, the data is compiled from 4 publicly available sources. The Transit Cost Project, led by Eric Goldwyn, Center for Transportation, led by Roni Avaz, Stephen Witkins, and of course, Metrolinx. So some people would say, well, high costs in Canada are because countries with authoritarian governance have easier time acquiring land, or countries with low GDP have lower costs. Well, this is not the case. So the chart you're looking at is just the isolated OECD developed nations in our database. And you can see the lowest cost countries are Spain, Italy, South Korea, and Turkey. Those are, all developed countries with high GDPs, similar to Canada and the US. And of course, just to give you some context, the Shimbundong line on the top right is a mostly underground 6-car regional rail line. It's fully automated. It's an express metro, and it costs, just over half of what the Finch West LRT costs per kilometer in Toronto, which is a surface tramway. And some other people would say, well, it's cost of living and labor, right? Like Toronto's an expensive city, Canada's an expensive country to live in. Well, if we look at the Nordic countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, they have some of the most robust welfare states in the world. They have incredibly high wages, but also incredibly high cost of living. And yet they can also deliver projects at 1/5 to 1/10 the cost that we do here in Canada. And lastly, a lot of people have told me, well, it's because our projects are really complex, right? Like downtown Toronto, it's a maze of utilities, costs us a lot of money, and there's a lot of risk involved. Well, all these low cost and Nordic countries, one measure of the complexity of a project is the amount of tunnel being used. And the low cost and Nordic countries build the same or greater proportion of their projects underground. And of course, they're dealing with significantly older cities. Like Italy is putting a metro line under the 2,000-year-old Colosseum, right? The city of Toronto is like 200, 300 years old. So other countries build more complex projects at lower costs. So what's the through line here? Well, every country with a transit project over $1 billion per kilometer speaks English as its primary language. Now, if we stop speaking English and we all start speaking Spanish, that wouldn't solve our cost problem. But this is more to say that, the costs of a project are not tied to these kind of external factors. They're tied to our project delivery practices, the way we govern projects and our institutions in these countries. So Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Singapore, UK, US, we all go to the same conferences. We all look to each other for new practices and thoughts, and we learn from each other. And it's almost like we're in a bubble. We've created a cost bubble. And you can see this trend further reflected if we look at the distribution of costs across countries. In Turkey, South Korea, Italy, and Spain, costs have, inflation adjusted, have, either remained steady or declined over time, while in Canada and the English-speaking world, they have increased exponentially. So it's time to question, what do we consider best practice, right? A lot of times we refer to the UK and Australia, like Infrastructure Ontario likes to cite the Sydney Metro and Crossrail as projects of, high quality. Well, they were nice, but they were also extremely expensive and over budget. So this is a great quote from our literature review: because the greatest innovation in the high quality, low cost public works is not really in any country where English is the primary language, North American governments should maintain global curiosity. So let's get into what drives cost. We have time for 2 drivers today: design choices and, of course, procurement and management, so actually delivering the project. We'll start with design. So our study has found that, Canadian transit agencies tend to overbuild their projects. Partially, it's because of stricter interpretations of safety standards, right? If we look on the left, you can see a single bore tunnel in the Toronto Scarborough subway extension, and it's significantly larger than the single bore used in Milan's M1, partially because we read the NFPA 130 fire requirements and we thought there had to be a fire separation wall, and it significantly increased the diameter of bore, which increases cost by a large margin. We also have a lack of standardization. So if you compare Milan's M5 with Toronto's Vaughan extension, M5 has these very Spartan standardized stations. They all look the same. They're like $11 million each. And in Toronto, we went for this kind of bespoke custom designs to fit every neighborhood context or whatever. Oh, that comes with a significant price increase and almost 10 times more. And of course, lastly, we like to buy political support. On the left is the Yonge North Subway extension, which when homeowners in Royal Orchard, a very wealthy community, protested because they were scared that tunnel boring machines under their house would shake them, Metlink caved, and we said, okay, we'll dig 10 to 20 meters deeper because you guys are scared of tunnel boring machines. And often this is a risk-averse perception of political support and not actually guarantees any of it. So low-cost projects avoid overbuilding. Instead, from tunneling, they choose low-cost tunneling methods and they avoid tunneling wherever possible. With stations, they try to build as small of a station as possible to reduce the amount of excavation. With right-of-ways, they try to acquire as much existing right-of-way and reduce the amount of land acquisition. That's how the Montreal REM was so cheap. And in standardization, of course, we covered that they standardize so that lessons can be transferred within the project, but also to other projects in the project delivery pipeline. So let's actually deliver the project now that we have the design. So the AAC manual, which is like a cost manual we use in North America, every kind of North American English, or sorry, every English-speaking country has their own flavor of this. Australia uses the Ernst & Young P90 method. What these do is it tells us how much we think a project is going to cost. So AAC says, well, we're trying to achieve an 80% cost confidence interval that the project is going to come sort of within a range that we set. Okay, so that's the explicitly stated goal here, is to make sure that the project comes under budget rather than manage the actual absolute cost of the project. So let's see what that does. So we start with our design choices that choose the hard costs. Well, okay, North American agencies are extremely reliant on professional services. So that means private external consultants. We add a 20% premium on top of our design choices. Now, this is completely arbitrary. And then, to manage the project risk, what if something goes wrong? What if we run into, difficult soil conditions or whatever? We add a chunk of money called contingency, which is basically in case things go wrong. And again, it's a percentage on top of the percentage. So we are multiplying the design choices and professional services by 35% and slapping that on top. We then have the post-contract contingency, which is very common, which is to sort of manage the litigation around these projects. And then we go to escalation, which is the inflation of a project. We try to run these complex models that try to predict what the inflation rate is going to be for the next 10 years. It's between 2 to 5% year over year. Now, if I could predict the inflation of the next 10 years, I would be working in Warren Buffett's office, probably not in transit. And of course, then we add property and taxes. So what you end up with is a project budget where only 35% on average of the hard costs, right, the costs that are actually building the project, make up a project budget, while the rest of the budget, 65% is soft costs. So that's to cover project delivery processes. And so what we find from our research is that the proportion of soft costs in North American projects significantly exceeds comparable projects in other developed nations. Right, on the left is a graph of an average of about 6 North American projects from Toronto to Montreal to Los Angeles. We see soft costs make up the majority of costs, while in Italian projects where project delivery is more efficient, soft costs are about 23%. So what's happening here is we're padding the budget, right, to avoid going over budget, which is not necessarily the problem in itself, but it's indicative of a larger problem, that we have an inefficient project delivery regime, right? The fact that we need this much extra money to cover for inefficiency in our project delivery is a cause for concern. And of course, even when we pad the budget, we go over anyway. It's almost expected that projects in North America will go over budget, from Toronto to LA, to Montreal to Seattle. we've seen insane cost overruns because padding the budget, right? It means money is set aside, and money set aside is money spent. It incentivizes being lax with the budget, right? We have things we have to cover. Okay, fine, we'll spend the money. And it gets even worse when we think about how that cost estimate influences future projects, right? When we put a cost estimate out to procurement, the market usually comes in higher because, well, they know exactly how we cost our project. And because the next set of projects is based on the cost estimates of the previous projects, well, that's how we end up in this cycle of cost escalation. So how do we fix this, right? Low-cost countries on procurement, they focus on really transparent project delivery processes. They put in public benchmark costs and itemized contracts like in Italy and Turkey to make sure that not only is the public aware, but also the private contractors and public sector have symmetry. They also own the risk. They keep the risk in the public sector rather than giving it away to the private sector. Because if we price risk into procurement for the public sector to take, or for the private sector to take on, it results in a lot of extra overhead. And they also minimize contingencies. So, for example, in Italy and Turkey, they set like 7 to 12% contingency maximums that includes the cost of inflation. And what that allows is it sets an incentive for agencies to try to control the absolute cost of the project rather than staying within some kind of arbitrary budget. And let's move on to management. So we need to create strong agencies, right? We're overly dependent on consultants. We must build the expertise within agencies to expedite decision making. And what that allows us to do is do more of our tasks in-house, right? We can reduce reliance on external consultants, and then the public sector knows what it wants. So when it goes to procurement, when it goes to market, we have a concrete design. We avoid all these change orders and the effects of not having a strong public sector. So some key takeaways from this presentation, high costs are not inevitable, right? Like they're not a result of external factors or force of nature. They're a result of deliberate choices that we make in planning and design, procurement costing, project management, stakeholder engagement, governance and politics, and the capacity of our construction sector. These are all things that are fixable. And lastly, I want to leave you with the goal of cost control is not to reduce scope, right? I'm not sitting here as a conservative trying to get you to cut your transit project or your transit project budgets, but it's saying that if we can deliver at lower cost, we can deliver better value and have more projects built. So say we could build for the cost of Paris, line 15 at $190 million per kilometer, we could get 5 Ontario lines for the price of 1. That's the potential we have here, and that's what I leave you with today. Thank you very much. I welcome any questions.
Jedwin, great presentation, really interesting. I never thought that speaking English was a cause of increased capital costs, but that's I'll keep that in mind. Now I do have we got to wrap up, but I do want to ask a question. In your comparison of different potential factors in your literature review of the 1,000 systems, I noticed you looked at all sorts of different things. You did not, at least you didn't present one that compared different formats of P3 versus non-P3, bid design versus, and this sort of gets at something you mentioned at the end about bringing things back in. With the old design bid approach, it was all done internally. And the whole reason, but people perceived that being very inefficient and perceived that moving to P3s would externalize the risk factor and pass it on to the private sector. I've never believed that because I looked at the Croton line and other examples where the private sector just walked away from the risks that had gotten out of hand for them. And now I know Metrolinx has introduced a new collaborative approach to try to compensate for some of those, but the P3 approaches have increased dramatically those soft costs in terms of lawyers and so forth, and it's something that's always been used in England and in Canada. But it's not very clear to me because the US does not use P3 for transit projects, and yet their costs are even higher than Canada's. So any thoughts about that whole topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something we covered in our study, but it's a whole other can of worms. And didn't want to touch in this presentation, but yes.
I,
So
I understand you have to be diplomatic, but still in general terms.
yeah, absolutely. So what the literature has found is that in general, um, low cost projects abroad use design bid build. So that's the traditional procurement you talked about, right?
Yeah,
So the public sector takes it to a certain percent of design, then they contract out the construction. Well, what we see in US cases, right? Like it, those cases are high cost despite using quote unquote the correct procurement model because
right.
the agencies lack a lot of expertise, right? And they hire consultants to kind of fill the gaps during the design phase. And they're really inefficient. They don't know, um, they don't know what the scope of the project is going to be. So what happens is even during the project execution phase, there's the same inefficiencies that we're seeing in Ontario, despite a difference in procurement model. And I can also speak, on the contrary, right? Like the lowest cost projects in Canada, like the Canada Line and the REM, were both extremely privatized in terms of risk, right?
Yeah,
Where we gave away all the risks to the private sector. And in fact, it's an interesting uh, duality, right? Like the Canada Line, for example, was able to be so cheap because the contractors, SNC Lavalin, were basically they had so much risk and they needed to keep the project under budget. So and TransLink allowed them to make the decision to switch to cut and cover during the project delivery phase. So I guess it depends on who the decision makers are and are they also accountable for the risks. Because CDPQ, for example, delivering the REM in Montreal, they are the decision makers and they are accountable for the risk and they are able to deliver projects. So instead, like in Ontario, what we're seeing is we're kind of in this halfway point where like we want to give a lot of risks away to the private sector, but also like we want to manage them and want to oversight. So like we're in this strange middle ground that's not working. And it's the reason why, it gets back to the reason why I didn't want to talk about procurement is because it's more to do with risk. Like who is taking charge of the risk? Who is making decisions? And are those decisions, contributing to reducing the risk?
yeah. Okay, we can have a discussion because
Yeah,
like I said, I don't believe the risk is ever really passed on to the private sector.
right.
First of all, second of all, I also believe that part of it is um, the lack of transparency. So that makes it cheaper in the sense that
Yeah,
you don't have to be accountable. You don't have to you don't have to follow. I mean, the REM did not follow environmental rules. They had a very negative environmental assessment, and yet it didn't matter because they overrode. They were given the power to override any issues of that sort. But if you try to keep accountability and transparency, the soft costs are going to go up because you have to have more consultations. You're going to have to modify you can't just decide to do cut and cover like that. You're going to be forced into tunneling more and so forth. So it's still a very complicated issue. But
yeah, absolutely. And I think like it's interesting because the literature sees transparency as almost a paramount in low cost countries, right? Like Italy and Turkey, for example, publish like costs for everyone to see. Anyone can go look at them. Even the government develops like benchmark costs for what the government is expected to pay. So that's a form of transparency. But then the other form of transparency is with like community engagement. I think that's more with like the process of community engagement. And when you look at like low cost countries like Spain, a lot of times they do community engagement, but they don't allow the community to kind of infringe their kind of perceived wants and desires on the project. And instead cost effectiveness is the priority. So it's an interesting contrast.
yeah, there are some comments in there. One Okay, now a lot of the projects are underway. I mean, I guess the decisions have already been made, but do you think this kind of reflection of what that you've been involved in will have an impact on future uh, projects? I don't know. Like the Hamilton one or the future Brampton one, I don't think are have been decided in terms of well, maybe Hamilton's already been decided. I don't know, but I don't know. Just it's a good question. I don't think you could actually answer that. So
A great question. I can't answer, obviously, but
yeah,
I mean, I'm just a researcher, so I don't
yeah,
have much
yeah.
power. But
There. and like we said, and Michael points out that the three lower cost ones are full scale P3. So it goes both ways. It's not clear at all. Okay, there's some other good comments in there, but I think in the interest of time, yeah, there's issues are raised about cutting corners and about the lack of Canadian content and things of that sort. But anyway, fascinating discussion, and I will turn it over to Amer to wrap up today. Thank you very much.